Hey, welcome back once again to Spooky Bricks. This time we're going to be looking at my build of the Old Dutch Church of Sleepy Hollow. The church was built in the late 1600s and is the second oldest church in the state of New York. But more importantly, for the purposes of this video, it plays a fairly significant role in Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. When Ichabod Crane is trying to escape from the Headless Horseman, he's headed towards the bridge that leads right to the church. So the village of Sleepy Hollow is very hilly. In fact, during my first trip, I learned that a hollow is the dip in between hills. I honestly had no idea, but the church sits on top of one of these hills. So I wanted to represent that in my build by raising it up higher. So the very first thing I did was to build some support structures for the church, bringing it up to the height that I wanted. And then I just built the church on top of that. The walls of the church are made up of some rustic stonework. So to try to mimic that look, I use all kinds of pieces and techniques such as masonry bricks, 1x2 tiles on snot bricks, and the rounded 1x2 plates, which is probably one of my favorite ways to represent stone walls. Now, buildings like this can make it a little difficult to mimic in LEGO because you have all kinds of colors going on in there, and it can be hard to figure out which colors to use and which colors to not use. But if you just squint your eyes, you see some tans and grays, so I use mostly light bluish gray, dark tan, and add a little bit of regular tan and dark bluish gray too. So I think that resembles the colors of the real walls pretty closely. The windows are probably my favorite part of this build, and they're also the section that took the most problem solving. The first issue I ran into was how to handle the brick framing around the windows. My first thought was to use tiles on snot bricks like this, but I wasn't sure as to how to get them around the curve of the arch, and on top of that, they were just a little too big in comparison. If you look at the real building, the bricks around the windows are actually much smaller than the stones in the wall, and if I used 1x2 tiles for the bricks, then they would have been about the same size as the stones, which it might not seem like a big deal, but it bothered me. So believe it or not, the bendable rigid bar pieces have a use other than just cat chew toys. They can be used to create curved brick and sloped stonework for archways. You just need some 1x1 clips and 1x1 plates, and you just put the plates on the clips, then attach them to the bar like so. And then at the top peak of the arch, you add 2 of the cheese wedge slopes on clips, and the whole thing comes together sort of like this. I used jumper plates to stick the brickwork out half a stud, just so that it wasn't completely even with the wall. Creating the bottom section of the windows was pretty straightforward. I just used 6 of the 2x2 window pieces in white, but the upper part of the window took a little brainstorming. My first thought was to use these arched window pieces, but they don't quite fit the space and don't give me the shape that I wanted. I needed more of a pointed arch. Then I considered doing something with bars or hockey sticks, but none of that really panned out. So eventually I went with a different type of arched window with lattice, and I figured that that represented the look of the real windows fairly well. But this now presented a whole new problem, as these lattice window panes in white are apparently very rare and hence very expensive. I think they were only ever in like 1 or 2 sets ever, and I definitely was not willing to spend the money on them. So I did something that normally I would be very much against, and that is that I took some of the pearl gold lattice window panes, which are very common and very cheap, and just hit them with a little bit of white spray paint. Normally I wouldn't ever paint a Lego piece, but I made an exception in this case. So there was still one more problem, and that is that there was still a gap between the edge of the brick framing and the window with the lattice. So I solved that by using a flexible tube plugged into 2 cones on either side, and that filled in the negative space very well. The door area is built in a very similar way to the windows, but with some dark green brick-built doors. The roof is made up of dark bluish gray plates, which does tend to be the go-to color for roofs. Then I added some tiles on top of that for some extra texture. The steeple is made from 2 of the ornamented arch pieces, with some more dark bluish gray roofing on top of that. I also added some spooky animals here and there. So, moving on to the terrain. The road in front of the church is done in a similar style to the road that was on either side of my Sleepy Hollow bridge build, which consists of reddish-brown plates with rounded gray tiles to represent some random cobblestones. Then there's some dark tan angled plates along the sides to give the road more of a rustic, non-uniform shape. At the end of the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, all they find left of Ichabod is his hat next to a smashed pumpkin, so I made reference to that and I put a hat and a smashed pumpkin in the road. For the smashed pumpkin guts, I used one of the Power Burst pieces in trans orange. Then on top of that, I put a 2x2 round dome brick for what's left of the pumpkin, and for the stem, I used a black claw piece. The areas along the edges are built up with a lot of studs not on top techniques. I went through a whole lot of trial and error just to get everything to fit together nicely. I used a lot of the olive green plant pieces to give it a bit of an overgrown look. I like using the old style olive green flower stem pieces for plant detail, but they're notorious for having very poor clutch power and they get knocked over very easily. But I have found that putting them in between four studs as opposed to directly on top of a stud does help to keep them in place. So I took a page out of my Sleepy Hollow bridge mock and did an underground cutaway of the graveyard, where you can see all the skeletal remains of the inhabitants. When I took a tour of the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, I learned that a lot of the people buried in the graveyard were Revolutionary War soldiers, so I put a few of them in old-style military uniforms. I wrapped some of them in brown whips representing tree roots to make it look like they've been there for a very long time and the graveyard is slowly growing around them. I added a whole lot of detail around the edges of this build, and although I do think it turned out good, it does make it difficult to pick up and maneuver around without just knocking things right off. Moving up to the ground level, we have all kinds of tombstones. The 2x3 pentagonal pieces work perfectly as tombstones, but I didn't want to rely on them too much and make it too repetitive, so I also used things like flag pieces and the 2x3 plates with the rounded tops. I used a gargoyle from one of the collectible minifigure lines and I just turned the face around to make it look more like a statue. I also used this Minecraft piece. I have never played it before, so I have no idea what it is actually supposed to be, but for our purposes, it's a tombstone. According to local legend, there really is a headless Hessian soldier buried somewhere in the old Dutch church graveyard, and this is said to be where the legend of the Headless Horseman originated from. Every night his spirit would rise from the grave looking for his lost head. I also added a gravedigger for a fun little detail. Outside the graveyard, I made an old, flimsy iron fence out of spears. I always wanted to try to make a wrought iron fence with the black spears, and this finally gave me a good reason to. So let's talk about the tree. This is definitely the biggest and most complex tree I've made so far. Some of my first brick-built trees were very fragile and tended to fall apart if I wasn't too careful around them. So because of the larger size of this tree, I wanted to make sure that it was strong enough and I wasn't going to have to put it back together every time I bumped into it. I started out with making a Technic support structure, making sure that I had a nice solid foundation to build off of. I think too often brick-built trees are very rigid, straight, and inorganic looking, so I wanted to really push this tree build with a whole lot of curves and angles to give it much more of a natural look. Then I added some curved and sloped and tiled bricks on top of the Technic skeleton to give it some shaping. From there, I used Technic connectors to act as branches, then various bars and antenna for the even smaller branches, and finally I used horns, minifigure hands, claws, wands, droid arms, and carrot top pieces for the smallest ends of the branches. So when I originally made this build, I had all the leaves on the tree and on the ground in dark orange, and after sitting with it for a while, I felt that the leaves didn't have enough variety to them. The build is full of muted, drab, earthy tones, and the dark orange just sort of blended in with all of that. So I added a bunch of red leaves to the dark orange, and I think that really helped the build out a lot. The red and the dark orange look really good together. And lastly, I added some lights for that extra haunted look. So that's it for my mock of the Old Dutch Church of Sleepy Hollow. Make sure to check back soon for more spooky builds.
The next morning, the old horse was found without his saddle, soberly cropping the grass at his master's gate. The boys assembled at the schoolhouse and strolled idly about the banks of the brook, but no schoolmaster. Hans van Ripper began to feel some uneasiness about the fate of poor Ichabod and his saddle. In one part of the road leading to the church, he found the saddle trampled in the dirt. The tracks of horses' hooves deeply dented the road, and evidently at furious speed were traced to the bridge, beyond which was found the hat of the unfortunate Ichabod, and close beside it, a shattered pumpkin. The mysterious event caused much speculation at the church on the following Sunday. They shook their heads and came to the conclusion that Ichabod had been carried off by the galloping Hessian. The schoolhouse, being deserted, soon fell to decay and was reported to be haunted by the ghost of the unfortunate pedagogue, and the ploughboy, loitering homeward of a still summer evening, has often fancied his voice at a distance, chanting a melancholy psalm tune among the tranquil solitudes of Sleepy Hollow.